Good morning, FS 330 students. I hope you guys had a really great weekend. The weather in Raleigh was amazing, and I hope it was wherever you are as well. And you were able to get out and at least enjoy some of the outside, if not the company of other people. Um, so we'll start with announcements. This week you have one assignment due, and that's your STEAM 11 products homework that opens on Wednesday and is due on Friday at 11:59 p.m. And we don't have much more left for the remaining part of the semester. We have one more homework that's due, Yeast Leaven products, which will be next week. And then the extra credit assignments, which we've gone over before, the homework for chocolate, and then the virtual NC State Dairy Tour. So keep that in mind. There's 6 points available there to add to your lowest test grade. I am working on grading those exam 2 assignments, so be patient with me. Learning how to do this on Moodle is very different than actual paper exams, although I think I've got my method down, and now I need to just crank through it and make sure everybody is treated fairly and exams are graded. So we're working on that. A reminder about your comprehensive final exam. It is online, open book and notes, just like exam 2 was. It is not collaborative, so keep that in mind. Don't ask each other about these questions. Don't talk to each other about these questions until the exam is closed. It'll open on Wednesday, April 29th, and is due Friday, May 1st at 11:59 p.m. Make sure you get it done in that time. No extensions will be granted. If you have some technical issues, let me know immediately. Don't wait a day to tell me about it. And I would advise trying to get it done Wednesday or the Thursday morning. So if you do have some technical issues, we do have the capability to try to fix those for you. The test is composed of 40% new material. So 40% of the questions will be based on the new material we have covered, and that's all of our baking and dairy. So that's that basically the portion after spring break. 60% of the final is comprehensive questions. So there will be 5 comprehensive questions, and you get to choose 3 of those questions to answer. Don't answer all 5. I'll only grade the first 3. That's how it's going to work. I will caution you with these online exams. The Moodle gradebook is interesting to say the least. So I will try to make sure that you guys understand the different weights of the questions for these. But because it's choose 3 out of 5, it might be a little bit different. They will be 60% of the test, so usually each of those 3 questions is 20% of the total grade. I know that's a little bit crazy math, but hopefully I'll find some way to give you that information within the Moodle system of online tests. But if you have questions, the same thing will go again. If you have questions or problems, email me, call me, text me, whatever you need to do. Let's get them figured out so you can do well in the exam. All right, so last week we talked all about quick breads and different types of leavening, chemical leavening, steam leavening, mechanical leavening, yeast leavening, right? So we've got all these different kinds of leavening and how we can manipulate them to create different products. Really, the largest difference we saw in technique and then the types of leavening combined, chemical and mechanical, was in those brownies where we had fudgy brownies and cakey brownies. There was almost an inch difference in height when baked in the same pans using different methodology and different ingredients. Part of that had to do with the presence of chemical leavener and creaming. The different cookies were also quite a big difference, but that had more to do with the structure created within the dough by those ingredients. And so that chewy or soft cookie had a more domed structure because it had more flour, whereas the crispy cookie was very flat because it had lots of sugar, a limited amount of flour, and more lipid in there. And sugar and lipid are 2 of those things that melt at higher temperatures. We also had a little bit of rub dough with our cream scones and our biscuits. And if you remember, the cream scones had this type of texture where we had little bits of dough surrounded by fat. And then the biscuits were this more flaky texture where there were long pieces of dough surrounded by the fat. So this week, we're talking about steam leaven products. And these rubbed and laminated doughs are good examples of that. The reason those biscuits, those southern biscuits, were flaky was because of the moisture contained in the fat that's used here. It pushes those layers of dough apart when that moisture turns to steam in the oven. And laminated puff pastry is probably the best example of that leavening due to steam between two different layers of dough. With puff pastry, there's hundreds of layers because of the process of making it. So I wanted to show you a video of how to make puff pastry at home. If you have a lot of time on your hands, this is kind of a fun thing to do to see how it's made. Of course, it's sold in the freezer section. Pepperidge Farms makes great frozen puff pastry, much simpler than making puff pastry on your own. But it's still important to know the technique behind actually making it. All right, so we are going to go here. And I believe, yes, this is the video for puff pastry. All right, here we go. So they're making a dough. Right, they make the dough, chill it for a little while. Again, with these laminated doughs and rubbed doughs, the key is that the fat always remains cold, because you want that fat, that moisture that's emulsified within the fat to remain there and not melt out or be removed from the fat and then absorbed by the dough. So they're putting a block of butter in the center of this dough. They're folding it up like an envelope and sealing that down. Once this is laid out and sealed in, then you can see the precision in this. This is a very precise operation. Things are very carefully maintained in the shape. This is called a letter fold. It's sealed on the edges with just a quick tap. Okay. And typically what happens is this dough is chilled between each of these folds. And with each of these folds, you're stacking and creating more and more layers of a layer of fat, a layer of dough, a layer of fat, a layer of dough. See, it's a very neat, tidy square. It's chilled again and then brought out and rolled out again. Now the other thing to note is that with each of these rollings, you're generating more and more gluten. You're forming a stronger gluten network. Okay? Because it is a little bit like kneading that dough, the process of shear. And you can see that it is getting more and more difficult to roll out and to fold. The dough is becoming stiffer because of that gluten formation. All right, so that's puff pastry, and what we're looking for is very thin layers of dough next to fat, dough, and fat, dough, and fat. Hundreds of layers of this, and so this gives you this very separated structure when the water that's emulsified in that fat layer is vaporized and pushes those two dough layers apart. Now this gives you very distinct layers of dough because you've had a high amount of gluten formation. Keep in mind that as we're moving from left to right here, laminated dough is going to have the most gluten formation, and that's because of all the rolling and folding that you're doing with it. And that is actually essential to create the finished product texture, because these dough layers are quite elastic, so they stretch quite well and respond well to that expansion with steam. Okay, so that's one type of dough product. The next I want you to see is a pie crust.
Today we're going to be making my favorite pie dough. It involves equal parts flour and butter put into a bowl and smushed together with your hands. That's it. You don't need any fancy ingredients. You don't need special technique. You cannot make a dough like this in a food processor because the food processor blades are going to cut up the butter into small, tiny pieces that are going to be nothing like these big flaky chunks that are going to make this pie crust so flaky and delicious. So this pie dough is really great for any type of intricate lattice design because we're intentionally cultivating gluten so that the pie is strong and sturdy. You guys, all I'm trying to say is that this pie dough is really good and you should trust me. I love you. I want you to succeed, but that means that you need to listen to me, okay? Let's do this. So I'll just be like, now we're making pie dough. Flour, salt, sugar. The thing about sugar is that it does not make the pie crust sweet, it just helps with brownings, and then we're gonna whisk them up. This takes longer than you think. For this recipe, I'm gonna use American style butter. This pie dough is nearly 50% butter. We don't need any extra fat. So if you use a European style, it's just adding way too much fat. And also European style butters tend to be a little bit softer, which makes the dough squishy. And this is America. I'm gonna cut it into about 1/2-inch cubes. So I cut them basically into 4 long sticks. Then I come through and just cut them at approximately 1/2-inch intervals. Err on the side of slightly larger pieces rather than extra small pieces because the small pieces will incorporate too much and make the dough a little sticky. Just gonna toss the butter and the flour together and then just break them apart a little bit. We're going to start working the butter into the flour. Find a cube of butter, smash it in your hand, and set it aside. That's all you're gonna do. Smash. Can we get like a slow-mo smash? Like, we want the butter to be cold from the fridge, but not frozen. So if you've seen some kind of like pie dough tip about freezing your butter, don't do that. I didn't tell you to do that. This is so satisfying. This is my personal bubble wrap. Toss it around a little bit and make sure you didn't miss any. Phase 2, adding the water. I'm just gonna add it. This is just cold tap water. We don't need ice water, and we don't ever, under any circumstances, need to add more water or less water. The amount of water is fixed. If the dough seems too dry, it's probably too cold. If the dough seems too sticky or wet, it's probably too warm. I finish kneading it together by hand. When it's mostly together, I turn it out on the counter, and then I'll knead it for another second. And that's all it needs. I'm just gonna roll it into a large rectangle. So don't be afraid to use as much flour as you need to keep it from sticking. All the extra flour can be brushed off in the end. And about, say, halfway through, you can hit it with some more flour and then flip it over. And see there, you can see where it's starting to stick. And just throw some more flour down on top of it. So at this point, I'm gonna do some folding to the dough, and that's gonna create some layers that will help make a super flaky pie crust. And if you see any places that are really rough and uneven, you can kind of like sheet the dough over to even it up a little bit. And from there, I'm gonna fold it in half. This is enough to make 2 single crusted pies or 1 double crusted pie. So I'm just gonna cut it in half and start rolling for that. It is rectangular and the pie plate is clearly circular. However, it's really hard to preserve a very rectangular shape unless you're working towards it. So it'll all kind of work out in the end. And when it seems like it's about right, grab your pie plate and check that indeed it's large enough. And then we're gonna flip it over. And the dough is extremely flexible. It shouldn't crack or tear. And sling it into the pie plate. And then just push it down. So if you're making a single crusted pie, it really helps to have this layer be nice and even. Regardless of what kind of pie you're making, it's good to fold up this extra dough. And this builds up the height of the pie so that it can accommodate all the filling. More filling is better. I'll put one hand around the outside and take the index finger of my right hand and kind of compress it. And this just helps establish a good shape. And that's great. So I'm going to throw it in the refrigerator. Shaping the dough, it has to be refrigerated for 2 hours in order to firm up the butter that's softened and relax the gluten that we've developed. If you make the dough in advance, pop it in the fridge, and then come to roll it out, you're still gonna have to let it relax for 2 hours. So I like to just shape it right away.
All right, so that's how to make pie dough. And with that particular product, you could see how large the pieces of butter were. She didn't incorporate it into being very tiny pieces of butter. And then you noticed that when she was forming the dough, she didn't just make the dough, knead it a little bit, and then roll it into a pie plate shape. She ended up folding it, right? So she rolled it out, folded it, did that letter fold, and folded it in half. And that step is similar to this puff pastry creation, right? All of that folding is creating these layers of fat. Now, she did not have the very exacting, precise method of laminated puff pastry where the block of butter goes into the center of the dough and you are very meticulously making letter folds and then cooling the dough again, rolling it out, making a letter fold, cooling it again. Here, we just smashed it into large pieces. You took those large pieces and smashed them down and then let the action of kneading and folding the dough be what creates these long pieces of dough that is surrounded by fat. All right, and then because it's not quite as meticulous, there wasn't quite the level of gluten formed as we have with laminated puff pastry. We get this small separation between these pieces, not this very lofty slivers of dough that are separated by air here in the final product. Just slight lifting and separation of those layers, which gives us that flaky pie crust texture. So you can see that forming these different doughs, you can tell the amount of work that goes into them, how much the dough is manipulated. The more the dough is manipulated, rolled and folded and touched, the more gluten is going to be formed. How the fat is incorporated into that, whether it be cut into cubes and then smashed, or whether it be formed into a block and then very meticulously incorporated into the puff pastry, or we just have little tiny balls of fat here. How that happens is going to impact the final structure of the product, whether it's crumbly, flaky, or completely separated pieces of dough in the end. Okay, so I hope that difference between those different methods helps you understand the difference between the three different types of textures you're going to get, the three different levels of gluten that's formed, and the three different ways that fat is incorporated into this dough. Okay, so let's see. As we talk about steam leavened pastry, this steam is going to generate these separate layers. Now, this is a picture of the Palmier cookies that we would have made in class, and we wouldn't be making the puff pastry from scratch. We use Pepperidge Farms, and we go to the store and we just buy that frozen puff pastry dough and roll it out in sugar and then fold it up like these little snail creations shape here and bake them until they're golden brown on both sides. They are really extraordinary cookies, and I promise you next time you need a cookie recipe and you need it in a flash, try this one out. People are always so impressed with it and think you spent hours when you really just went to the store and bought puff pastry. But you can see the different layers here of dough that is in that puff pastry, and now you know how it was created. So this puff pastry dough is created the same way, the same method that you would create it at home. So in order to capture that steam that separates those layers, we have to develop that gluten. Okay, that's key to note there. Now, in something like a scone where you have the little balls of dough, you don't want to develop a tremendous amount of gluten. You want that to be a very tender product. Here, because we have so much leavening that can take place and so much lipid that's there, not only do we tenderize that product because of the lipid that's there, gluten can still form with lipid there. It just creates a more tender product when it's there and you have a lot of gluten development. This is true for many types of doughs. Enriched bread doughs like brioche doughs that are typically used to make things like cinnamon rolls. Those have lots of gluten development, but they also have a lot of lipid, and so they're very, very tender doughs to begin with. Okay, so make sure you understand that anytime we want to capture that steam, get that separation, we need to have gluten formed. All right, so I did want to show you one last video, and that's of the show pastry that we would have used to make eclairs. All right. All right, I'm just going to pause it because I'd like to talk to you over it, and we don't need the music. All right. So these are chocolate eclairs, and this is a classic use of choux pastry. This is a dough that is made on the stove and in the mixer, and one that creates a hollow center, which we'll see in just a little while. In class, we would have made cream puffs and filled them with chantilly cream, which is basically just sweetened whipped cream, or pastry cream, which is a sort of like a sweetened, scaled up version of a bechamel sauce. It's starch thickened, egg yolk enriched pastry cream. So it sets up and holds a shape really well. So it works great to fill things like eclairs and cream puffs. So here we initially start out on the stove. We've heated our liquids, butter, milk, and water, until that butter has melted. Bring it to a boil. Make sure it's nice and warm. And then we're going to put in flour. And if we're using sugar, we'll put that in too. And you see it makes this very elastic, stiff dough. The reason that you continue cooking it is you want to make sure that you're gelatinizing that starch. After this dough has formed, you want to beat in the eggs. Now, we would do this with a mixer in class. But now, after you've evaporated a lot of that moisture off and the starch has been absorbed, you are adding a lot of moisture back in, right? So not only are you adding moisture in, you're adding a lot of proteins from those eggs back into this dough, and you can see how it changes. It has a lot of extension quality to it, meaning that you can stir it and it follows your spoon around. But this is definitely a more fluid product than just when that flour, butter, water, and milk mixture came off the stove. All right. So there you go. You see it can hold a shape, but it would be pipeable, which is exactly what the next step is. So piping bag, fill that piping bag up, and then we're going to pipe out, these would be eclairs. And you want to make sure that your shape is good. Not having any little tips on them helps them not create little brown spots and be very evenly browned all over once they come out of the oven. So notice how much they puff, right? They definitely expand quite a lot, and that's because of the water that's present in the eggs that you're whipping back in. Oftentimes, people recommend that you open the eclairs or the cream puffs immediately so that all the moisture can come out. If these products don't, see how hollow that is on the inside. Perfect for a filling. If you don't let them completely dehydrate in the oven or enough moisture get out of there, then what ends up happening is they collapse because the structure is not set yet. Right? So very important to make sure these are properly cooked and dried out before moving from the oven. But that nice hole that's formed in the center is entirely due to the amount of steam that is formed from whipping the eggs back in. Those eggs have a lot of moisture, and if you look at the recipe, there's a lot of eggs to the amount of flour that's there. So we're putting in quite a bit of protein. We're putting in quite a bit of moisture to puff up that nice case of structure that we've formed. With all the stirring, we're forming a lot of gluten, and we're also making sure the starch is gelatinized so it can have a starch network around it too. Now, the starch network is not quite as elastic as a gluten network, but it will help hold that shape up that the steam is creating, and once it dries out, then it holds that shape quite well. So that's puff pastry. Now, I want you to start thinking about this in entirety. We've done quick breads, and we've talked about steam leavened breads. Let's see, the other things that we have going on here is Yorkshire pudding, which is very similar to popovers. I encourage you again, if you have a bowl and ingredients, these are really basic ingredients. If you have that in your house, try some popovers. They are about the most simple baking thing that you can do. Really easy, don't require a whole lot of ingredients, and they are terrific, very simple. So the pie crust, the quiche, palmiers, and cream puffs would have been what we would have made this week. Last week we definitely had more brownies and cookies, biscuits and scones. All of these things start in a basic way. We're mixing them together. They go in the oven, and then they come out to cool. Okay? So, what I want you to start thinking about is all of the different chemical reactions, the physical reactions that are happening when we start working with these products at the different stages. So, initially, what we have during mixing, depending on the amount of mixing, we have gluten formation. If we don't have a lot of mixing, then we have very little. Sometimes that's desirable. If we want a lot of structure and a lot of elasticity to be present, we have a lot more mixing or folding or rolling, any of these activities that is causing the dough to be stretched, energy is being put into that dough, that's going to create gluten formation. So we have that present there. We might have some fat melting at this point because we're going from cold temperatures often with butter or room temperature, and we're mixing, and that causes some friction and warming. We have CO2 that's created. If we've got chemical leavening at this mixing stage, we've definitely got CO2 that's evolved when we start mixing these things together. Okay, so start thinking along those lines of all the different types of reactions. Now, which reactions you're focusing on, either hindering or helping, they may be there, they may not in the case of chemical leavening. Start thinking about where these things are happening. And this Wednesday, we're going to talk about that more. What's happening during mixing? What's happening during heating in the oven? How do we go from this bowl of batter, creamed butter and sugar with eggs and milk and flour added in to a dry, dense texture of cake here, right? What's happening on the surface? What's happening on the interior in the oven? Think of all of those different reactions. And then what's happening during cooling? Cooling is actually one of the critical stages of making baked goods, and we don't really think about it, right? If you take a yeast spread out of the oven and immediately slice into it, it is going to be a gooey mess, right? Cooling is critical. It's critical with lots of different baked goods, and so we need to be cognizant of that fact and really think about what's happening during cooling, okay? So that's your homework. That's going to be on the worksheet for Wednesday, is to start listing out reactions. And we're going to talk about this when we get to Wednesday. So give that some thought prior to Wednesday's Zoom call, and we can all have a conversation about these things and what's going on. We will also focus a little bit more on the steam leavened product so that we can get a good feel for that. All right, until then, I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.